The Imperial Japanese Navy called the Yamato the pride of the fleet and built her to be unsinkable. At least, that was the idea, and for a while the fact of her was the most closely guarded secret in Japan. She was the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, and nothing else in the world came close. She was constructed behind high fences and camouflage netting so that no foreign eye could measure her. And when she was finished, she carried 9 guns of a caliber no navy had ever put to sea, 18-inch rifles that could throw a shell weighing nearly 1.5 tons across 25 miles of ocean. She was armored more heavily than any ship that had ever floated. She was meant to be the answer to a problem of arithmetic, a Japan that could never outbuild the United States ship for ship, and the answer was to build a handful of battleships so enormous and so powerful that each one could stand against several American ships at once and win. She was the physical form of a doctrine, the belief that the war in the Pacific would be decided, as wars at sea had always been decided, by great fleets of battleships hammering each other with big guns until one line broke. The Yamato was the ship that would win that battle. She was the mightiest weapon Japan ever made. She spent almost the entire war doing nothing, and then she was thrown away. In 3.5 years of service, she fired those enormous guns at an enemy ship on exactly 1 day, to no confirmed effect. And then, in April 1945, she was sent on a one-way mission with no realistic hope of survival, and she was sunk in a couple of hours by American aircraft before she ever reached her target. Of the roughly 3,300 men aboard her, about 276 survived. More than 3,000 died, not damaged, not retired from service, gone. The most powerful battleship in the history of the world had a career that amounted to years of idleness, followed by a single afternoon of catastrophe. And this is the story of what it was to be one of the men who lived aboard her, inside the largest and proudest and most useless warship ever built. Start with the contradiction, because the contradiction is the whole of it. The Yamato was obsolete before she was ever commissioned, and the men who conceived her could not see it. She was laid down in 1937 and finished at the very end of 1941, formally commissioned about a week after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was the proof, delivered by Japan's own Navy, that the age of the battleship was over. It was aircraft flying from carriers that had crippled the American battle line in a single morning at Pearl Harbor. It would be aircraft, again and again, that decided the great battles of the Pacific, at the Coral Sea and at Midway and in the Philippine Sea, battles in which the opposing fleets never even saw each other because the killing was done by planes flying 100 miles out. The doctrine the Yamato had been built to serve, the vision of 2 lines of battleships slugging it out with big guns, was a vision of the previous war, and it died in the opening months of this one. Japan had poured a staggering share of its steel and its industry and its skilled labor into building the 2 largest battleships ever made, the Yamato and her sister Musashi, at exactly the moment when battleships had ceased to be the thing that won wars. The most powerful ship afloat was, from the day she entered service, a magnificent answer to a question nobody was asking anymore. Japan had chosen this path deliberately and out of a desperation of its own. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the great naval powers had bound themselves by treaty to limit the size and number of their battleships, and Japan, always the smaller industrial power, had accepted a fleet smaller than those of Britain and the United States. In the mid-1930s, Japan tore up those agreements and walked away, and having done so, its naval planners reasoned that, since they could never hope to match the American shipyards in sheer numbers, they would beat them in quality instead, building a few battleships so overwhelmingly large and powerful that no single American ship could stand against them. The Yamato class was the fruit of that reasoning. Each ship swallowed an immense share of the nation's steel and skilled labor and shipyard capacity, resources a resource-poor country locked in a total war could ill afford, poured into a handful of enormous hulls. Whole industries were bent to the task. It was a gamble that the one great decisive battle would come, and that when it came, these giants would be there to win it. A gamble made by men who had studied the last war and prepared, as soldiers so often do, to fight it again. The gamble failed on both counts. The decisive battleship duel never came in the form the planners had imagined, because carriers and aircraft had changed the rules. And the giants, when they finally did fight, could not win because the thing that came to kill them was not another battleship, but the airplane, against which all their size and armor was not enough. The secrecy in which she was built tells you how much Japan believed in her. She was constructed at the naval yard at Kure, in a dry dock specially deepened and enlarged to hold her, and the whole project was wrapped in a level of concealment extraordinary even for a warship. The dock was screened with enormous fences and roofed over where it could be, and hung with vast curtains of camouflage netting and sisal rope so that no one, not a foreign spy, not even most of the Japanese who worked in the yard, could see the full shape of what was being built. The workers were sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. Details of her design were split up so that few men understood the whole. It worked so well that the United States Navy went into the war with no real idea of what it was facing, believing, if it thought about the new Japanese battleships at all, that they carried guns no larger than the 16-inch weapons of the American fleet, when in fact, the Yamato's guns were a full 2 inches larger in bore and hurled a far heavier shell. She was a secret weapon in the most literal sense, a ship whose very existence and true power were meant to come as a shock, the ace that Japan was keeping up its sleeve for the decisive battle that was supposed to come. The men chosen to serve in her did not know she was obsolete and would not have believed it if they had been told. They were the elite. Service aboard the Yamato was a coveted posting, the men hand-picked, the flagship of the combined fleet, the ship the admirals themselves lived aboard. To be assigned to her was to be told that you were among the best the Navy had, that you would serve at the very center of the fleet, aboard the ship that everyone knew would one day fight the decisive battle and win it. And for a young sailor, there was something genuinely awe-inspiring about her. The sheer scale of the thing, a steel island more than 860 feet long, her main turrets each as heavy as a destroyer, her guns so large a man could crawl into the barrel. The crew was proud of her in a way that is hard to convey. She was the biggest and the strongest, and they were the ones who served her. And in the early days of the war, when Japan was winning everywhere, that pride seemed entirely justified. Then came the waiting, and the waiting was its own particular corrosion. The Yamato's problem, once the war turned, was that she was too valuable to risk and too expensive to use. She burned fuel at a tremendous rate, hundreds of tons a day just to keep her enormous engines turning, and by the middle of the war, Japan's fuel supply was strangling so that every hour her engines ran was oil the Navy could barely spare. Her giant guns needed special ammunition for shore bombardment that often was not available. The waters where the fighting was hottest were shallow and poorly charted, dangerous for a ship that drew so much water. And above all, she was the pride of the fleet, and the admirals could not bring themselves to hazard her in the kind of desperate, grinding fights where she might be lost. So she sat. For long stretches of the war, the mightiest battleship in the world lay at anchor in a fleet base, safe, idle, her enormous guns pointed at nothing, while the war was decided elsewhere by other men, in smaller ships and in aircraft. The rest of the Navy noticed, and the rest of the Navy had a name for it. The sailors on the destroyers and the cruisers and the carriers, the men who were out fighting and dying in the running battles of the Solomons and the Central Pacific, looked at the great battleships lying safe in harbor and called them, with bitter contempt, the Hotel Yamato and the Hotel Musashi. The big ships were where you went to be comfortable and safe while everyone else did the fighting, and there was a hard grain of truth in the insult. The Yamato was, by the standards of a warship, a relatively comfortable place to be. She was so large that her spaces were less brutally cramped than those of a destroyer, and her senior officers in particular lived well, with good food and roomy quarters, so that while the crews of the smaller ships ate poorly and slept in misery and were killed in their hundreds, the men of the great battleship rode at anchor in relative ease. To the men doing the dying, the Yamato was not the pride of the fleet. She was a floating hotel where the Navy's most powerful weapon was being kept safe from the war. And for the ordinary sailor aboard her, the idleness was not comfort. It was shame, and it was boredom, and it was a slow poison. Imagine being a young man on that ship. You were told you were the elite, aboard the mightiest warship ever built, and then you spent month after month at anchor while the reports came in of one defeat after another, of other ships lost with all hands, of the war being lost around you, and your enormous ship, your invincible ship, did nothing. You drilled, you cleaned, you maintained the guns that never fired. You watched the horizon. You knew that men on the smaller ships despised you for the safety of your posting, and some part of you may have despised yourself for it. The pride curdled. The elite crew of the greatest battleship in the world became, in effect, spectators at their own country's defeat, kept safe and useless while everything went to pieces. And there is a specific kind of psychological weight in that. In being told you are the best and then being given nothing to do but watch and wait for a battle that never came. The daily life aboard her, for the thousands of enlisted men who were not senior officers, was the hard, repetitive routine of any warship, stretched out across the long emptiness of the idle months. More than 2,000 men, and by the end, more than 3,000 lived inside her hull, organized into divisions, standing watches around the clock, and drilled and cleaned and stood their watches and slept in shifts, and the giant ship demanded ceaseless maintenance, acres of steel deck to be scrubbed, thousands of tons of machinery to be tended, the great guns and their intricate mechanisms to be kept in perfect order for the battle that kept not coming. And when the Yamato moved south to the fleet base at Truk in the tropics, the heat came into her, because a steel ship under a tropical sun becomes an oven, and the spaces deep inside her, the engineering compartments and the interior berthing, grew stifling and close, the air thick and wet. The men sweated through their days and their nights. They ate their rice and their rations in shifts at mess tables, better fed than the men on the destroyers, but eating the same meals in the same rotation, month upon month. And always there was the boredom, the terrible boredom, of a crew kept at a state of readiness for an event that never arrived, drilling for a battle that was always somewhere over the horizon and never came, growing stale, growing restless, aging inside a ship that did nothing. Set the numbers down, because the numbers are the measure of the waste. The Yamato displaced nearly 72,000 tons at full load, which made her almost half again, as large as the biggest American battleships. She was about 863 feet long. Her main armament was 9 18.1-inch guns, mounted in 3 enormous triple turrets, and those guns fired a shell weighing close to 3,200 pounds, a projectile the size of a small car, out to a range of about 25 miles. No navy has ever built bigger naval guns. Each of those 3 main turrets weighed around 2,500 tons, more than an entire destroyer, and a man could stand upright inside the barrel of one of her guns. Her armor was on the same scale, a belt of steel some 16 inches thick along the waterline, and the faces of her main turrets protected by plate around 26 inches thick, the heaviest armor ever fitted to a warship, meant to shrug off the heaviest shells any enemy could fire. She could make about 27 knots. She carried by the end a crew that numbered more than 3,300 men, and a forest of anti-aircraft guns, 24 5-inch weapons, and well over 150 smaller automatic cannon, bolted on in ever greater numbers as it became clear that aircraft, not other battleships, were what she had to fear. She was, by every measurement of the shipbuilder's art, the ultimate expression of the battleship, and she was built to fight a kind of battle that the war had already made extinct. Her great guns were a spectacle unto themselves, and firing them was a violent business even for her own crew. When the 9 18-inch rifles fired together in a full broadside, the blast was so tremendous that any man caught in the open on the wrong part of the deck could be hurt by the concussion alone, and the anti-aircraft gunners at their exposed mounts had to take shelter whenever the main battery let go, lest the shock waves injure them. The guns could be laid on a target more than 20 miles away by a fire control system fed by great optical rangefinders and, later in the war, by radar, and a well-drilled turret crew could load and fire one of the monstrous shells about once every 40 seconds, the loading itself a ballet of hydraulic rammers and hoists moving projectiles that weighed as much as a small car. For defense against aircraft, the main guns could fire a special shell packed with hundreds of incendiary fragments and steel rods that burst in a great cone in the path of an oncoming formation. A weapon that looked terrifying and did surprisingly little real damage, and that was so violent in the firing that it wore out the very barrels it was fired from. Everything about her armament was the largest of its kind ever built. The turrets were the size of buildings, the shells the size of men, the magazines beneath them holding tons upon tons of powder and projectiles, and almost none of it, in 3.5 years, ever did to an enemy what it had been so enormously and expensively designed to do. The design of her protection followed a single idea, the same idea the Germans had built into their own great battleships, that a warship should be able to keep floating and fighting even after it has absorbed terrible punishment. The heart of her was an armored citadel, a great box of the thickest steel wrapped around her engines and her magazines and her vital spaces, so that even if the ends of the ship were shot to pieces, the core would survive and she would stay afloat. The scheme was brilliant, and it was aimed entirely at surviving the guns of other battleships, at winning the slugging match she had been built for. What it could not fully answer was the weapon that actually came for her, the airplane, and the torpedo dropped into the water against her hull below the belt, and the bomb dropped from above onto her decks. The Yamato was the most heavily protected ship in the world against the threats of the last war. Against the threat of this one, delivered from the air, her armor bought her time, hours of it, but in the end it could not save her, any more than it had saved her sister. Now, trace what she actually did, because the record is almost unbelievable for a ship of her power. She was the flagship of the combined fleet in 1942, and in June of that year, the admiral who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor directed the Battle of Midway from her bridge. But she was far to the rear, held back hundreds of miles behind the carriers, and she took no part in the fighting, so that the greatest battleship in the world was present at the most important naval battle of the war, and never fired a shot, as 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk by American planes. She left home waters for the great forward base at Truk in the summer of 1942, and she sat there through the long and desperate Guadalcanal campaign, unable to be usefully employed, and in the roughly 9 months she was based there, she spent almost the entire time swinging at anchor, leaving only for a single day. She was replaced as flagship by her sister, Musashi. On Christmas Day of 1943, she was hit by a torpedo from an American submarine, a single hit that let some 3,000 tons of seawater into her, flooded a space next to one of her main magazines, and sent her home for months of repairs. An early warning, had anyone wished to read it, that even the unsinkable ship could be holed by a weapon she never saw coming. She was refitted, her lighter secondary guns partly stripped away to make room for still more anti-aircraft cannon, and sent out again. She was present at another great carrier battle, in the Philippine Sea in 1944, and again played no part. And then there was the one day she fought, and even that ended in her being chased away. In October 1944, at the Battle off Samar, part of the vast fighting for Lady Gulf, the Yamato at last found herself in gun range of American ships. A powerful Japanese force had slipped through and fallen upon a small group of American escort carriers and their destroyer escorts, thin-skinned little ships with no business fighting battleships, and for a few hours the Yamato fired her great 18-inch guns at the enemy in anger for the first and only time in her life. And it came to nothing. Her enormous armor-piercing shells, designed to punch through the thick hides of other battleships, tended to pass clean through the flimsy hulls of the little escort carriers, without the devastating effect they would have had on a proper warship. She scored no confirmed decisive hits. And when the tiny American destroyers turned and charged the Japanese giants and launched their torpedoes, the Yamato was forced to turn away, to comb the tracks of the incoming torpedoes, and that turn carried her north, away from the battle, for a long stretch of crucial minutes, so that the mightiest battleship in the world spent part of her single engagement steaming away from the enemy to avoid the torpedoes of ships a fraction of her size. That was the sum of her fighting career. Years of idleness, one day of firing her main guns, no confirmed result, and even then chased off by destroyers. And the battle off Samar ended not with a triumph, but with a retreat that has been argued over ever since. The Japanese commander of the force, having caught the Americans by surprise with a group of thin-skinned, little escort carriers and destroyers seemingly at his mercy, lost his nerve or lost his grip on the shape of the battle in the smoke and the confusion and the ferocious counterattacks of the tiny American ships. Believing he faced a far stronger force than he did, and fearing the American carrier aircraft that were savaging his fleet, he broke off the action and turned away and withdrew, leaving the prize uncaptured. So, The one time the Yamato and her consorts actually got in among the enemy's ships, they let a handful of escort carriers and a few destroyers fight them to a standstill and drive them off, and then they turned around and went home. It was a fitting emblem of the whole grand strategy that had built her. The great guns, the mighty armor, the years of carefully husbanding the fleet's strength and its fuel and its finest crews for the one decisive blow, and when at last the moment came and the enemy was there to be struck, it all slipped away in confusion and doubt, and the giants sailed home in the darkness, having accomplished nothing that changed the course of anything. The men aboard the Yamato had watched their one chance to justify their existence come and go, and a few months later, they would be sent out to die without even that much of a chance. The Yamato's crew did not have to imagine what would happen if their ship were ever caught by American aircraft, because they had watched it happen to her sister. That same October, in the same enormous battle, the Musashi, the Yamato's twin, the other largest battleship in the world, was caught in the Sibuyan Sea by wave after wave of American carrier planes. For hours they came at her, and the Musashi, for all her armor, for all the anti-aircraft guns bristling from her, could not fight them off. She absorbed an almost incomprehensible amount of punishment, something on the order of 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over the course of the day, her great bulk slowly drowning under the endless attacks, before she finally rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 of her men down with her. The lesson was written in the clearest possible terms. The most heavily armored battleship ever built, a ship believed by many to be unsinkable, could be sunk by aircraft, given enough of them and enough time, and there was nothing the ship or her crew could do about it. The men of the Yamato knew this. They had lost their sister ship exactly this way before their eyes, and a few months later they would be ordered to sail into precisely the same situation, without air cover, and they would sail knowing exactly what awaited them. The order came out of desperation and out of a question from the emperor. By the spring of 1945, the war was all but lost. The Americans had landed on Okinawa, the last island before the Japanese home islands themselves, and the Imperial Navy, which had once been among the most powerful on Earth, had almost nothing left to fight with. Its carriers were sunk or without aircraft. Its fuel was nearly gone. When the emperor was briefed on how the Navy would help defend Okinawa, he is said to have asked, in effect, whether the Navy had no ships left, whether it would do nothing while the Army and the young kamikaze pilots died. The question landed like a rebuke, and the Navy's commanders, stung, cast about for some way to show that the fleet, too, would sacrifice itself. What they conceived was a mission for the last of their great ships, and at the center of it was the Yamato. The plan was, by any ordinary military standard, close to madness. The Yamato, together with one light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail from Japan toward Okinawa. She would fight her way through the vast American fleet surrounding the island, and when she reached the invasion beaches, she would run herself aground deliberately and become a fixed fortress, firing her enormous guns into the American ships and troops until she was destroyed. Her surviving crew would then go ashore and fight on land as infantry. She would have little or no air cover, which meant she would be almost helpless against the hundreds of carrier aircraft the Americans could throw at her, the same aircraft that had already sunk her sister. And she would be given, by most accounts, only enough fuel for a one-way trip, because there would be no coming back. The operation was formally a surface special attack, and in the language of the Imperial Navy, by 1945, special attack was simply the word for suicide, the same word applied to the kamikaze pilots flying their planes into American ships. The men of the Yamato were being sent, openly and officially, to die. Even the admiral chosen to lead it thought it was a waste. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would command the operation from the Yamato, objected to the mission as futile and wasteful, and for a time, he refused to actually give the order to carry it out. He was a professional, and he could see, as anyone could see, that sending the fleet's last great battleship to sea without air cover against the most powerful carrier force in the world was not an operation of war, but a gesture of despair, a way of throwing the ship and her crew onto the fire so that the Navy would not have to answer the Emperor's question with silence. In the end, he obeyed, when it was made clear that the sortie carried the weight of the whole Navy's honor behind it. On the 6th of April, 1945, the Yamato loaded her ammunition, a full outfit for her great guns, and many thousands of anti-aircraft shells, and made ready to sail. There was a bitter irony, even in the fuel. Japan was so short of oil by that point in the war that the fleet could barely move at all, and the sortie nearly foundered on the question of whether there was enough fuel to be spared for it. In the end, the ships were fueled, by some accounts with only enough to reach the waters off Okinawa and not to return. By other accounts with somewhat more, the oil scraped together from the last dregs of the Navy's reserves. There is a story, often told, that shore staff at the base drained fuel from storage tanks and handed it over on their own initiative, beyond what the official orders allowed, because they could not bear to send the great ship out any shorter than she had to be. Either way, the meaning was the same, and it was damning. The single most precious commodity the Japanese Navy had left, the oil without which no ship could move and no plan could be carried out, was being poured into the tanks of its greatest battleship to send her on a voyage from which she was not expected to come back. Every ordinary calculation of war would have counseled keeping the ship and the fuel and the 3,000 trained men aboard her safe at home for the defense of the islands that everyone knew was coming. The calculation that sent her out instead was not a calculation of war at all. It was a matter of honor and of face, and of a question from the Emperor that the Navy's leaders could not bring themselves to leave unanswered. The last night aboard, before she put to sea, was heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. The men understood, most of them, that this was a one-way voyage. Some of the youngest cadets and some of the sick men were ordered off the ship before she sailed, sent ashore so that they would not be thrown away with the rest, a mercy that told the men who remained exactly what the Navy expected to happen to them. There was sake that last night, and there were the small ceremonies of men who believe they are about to die, the writing of final letters, the quiet settling of accounts, the particular calm that can come over people when the worst has become certain and there is nothing left to do but meet it. Then, on the evening of the 6th of April, the Yamato weighed anchor and stood out to sea with her escorts, and turned south toward Okinawa and toward the end. The Americans knew she was coming almost before she cleared home waters. As the Japanese force passed down through the Bungo Channel between the home islands, it was spotted and then shadowed by 2 American submarines, which trailed the ships for hours and radioed reports of their course and speed to the American fleet, reports the Japanese radio operators could hear being sent. There was no surprise to be had. The Americans had ample warning, and Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58, a fleet of 16 fast aircraft carriers with all their escorts, prepared a reception. When morning came on the 7th of April, the Yamato and her escorts were steaming south in the East China Sea, in a defensive ring formation, and overhead, the American reconnaissance planes were already circling, tracking them, waiting. The men aboard the Yamato went to their battle stations and watched the sky and understood that there would be no fighting their way to Okinawa. The aircraft were coming, and there were hundreds of them, and the Yamato had no fighters of her own to meet them. The attack began a little after noon, and what followed over the next 2 hours is what the whole of the Yamato's existence had been building toward, and it was not a battle. It was a killing. The Americans launched something approaching 400 aircraft against the Japanese force in 2 great waves. The first wave came in, well over 200 aircraft, fighters and dive bombers and torpedo planes, and the Yamato threw everything she had into the sky against them. Her great 18-inch guns fired special anti-aircraft shells, enormous rounds that burst into clouds of burning fragments, and her dozens of 5-inch guns and her more than 150 automatic cannon filled the air with fire, and it was not enough, because it could never have been enough against that many aircraft with no fighters to break them up. The American planes bored in through the flak, the dive bombers planting their bombs on her decks and her superstructure, the torpedo planes coming in low against her hull, and the Americans attacked her with a deliberate, methodical understanding of how to kill a ship like this. Their torpedo bombers concentrated their attacks on one side of the ship, the port side, again and again, because they understood damage control. A ship torpedoed evenly on both sides can flood evenly and stay upright, but a ship struck over and over on the same